Hi, in the next few minutes here, we're going to attempt to understand poverty together. Now, this lecture has been titled Attempting to Understand Poverty for a few reasons. One, we're trying to discuss a huge and complex topic and theme that's difficult to get our minds and our hands around. And it's also a topic that varies greatly from context to context. So we can understand some broad generalizations, but then everything that we're discussing and studying and that you're reading about really has to be contextualized. And it's also a topic that the more we study it, the more we understand it, the more we realize that we really don't completely understand it at all. And so we need to hold our thoughts loosely so we can always adjust and be able to adjust the context at hand. And also, as we begin to discuss this theme, it's important to remember that we're not talking about objects, but we're talking about people. As Bryant Myers points out in the reading that you did, we need to begin by reminding ourselves that poverty is the condition of people, whom we describe abstractly as the poor. Referring to people by a label is always dangerous. We may forget that the poor are not an abstraction, but rather a group of human beings who have names, who are made in the image of God, whose hairs are numbered, and for whom Jesus died. The people who live in poverty are as valued, as important, as loved as those who do not. So as we begin, let's ask ourselves the question, what is poverty? How would you define poverty? How would you have defined poverty before you've done the reading and things for this class? Well, many of the secular and development agencies and even Christian agencies tend to define poverty as a lack of things, food, water, shelter, etc., or a lack of ideas, knowledge, or skills, job skills, or of the appropriate agricultural methods, etc., or as a lack of access to things such as credit, natural resources, or to the political system. What do all these definitions have in common? Well, it's pretty apparent that they're all about what we lack or what we don't have. So therefore, if I'm poor, I'm not a whole person. I need something to make me complete. Now, this would be a good point in time to mention that as we look at poverty, it's important our understanding of it and the causes of it, because from that, those things will drive our reactions and how we address the causes. So how we understand it is extremely important because from there will come our attitudes and our actions. And so as we do so, we need to keep in mind a few things. One is that people live in households. People aren't isolated by themselves usually. They're in a household unit, and many sociologists are beginning to look at people in households not as individuals as they contribute to things. It's the household that makes the decisions for how they're going to spend their time and their money and so on and so forth. Speaking of time and money, time, not money, is the most valuable asset that people have. We all have the same amount of time. It's an asset that we all possess, and how we leverage that asset is of extreme importance. And that individuals are embedded in a social system, not just the families, but the society and the culture in which they live. Whether they're in the middle of a city or a rural setting, they're embedded in a system that's bigger than themselves, and they're actors in that system or they're acted upon by that system. And it often for us as people, our relationships are more valuable than money or other assets that we have. Relationships that work for us or against us make a huge difference in our lives. We also need to remember that the poor are not necessarily lazy or fatalistic or ignorant. Oftentimes we have the impression that the poor are lazy. If they would just work harder, they would not be poor. But that is not the case. As I believe was pointed out in your reading, most people would consider that the lazy poor are actually dead. They don't have the luxury to be lazy. They have to work hard. And the other thing to keep in mind is that context matters. The poor are not simply a homogeneous group of people that are all the same across the board, but poverty and the people who find themselves in poverty are different from place to place. And that the poor live among the non-poor, and often it's these non-poor that have an agenda or a stake in keeping the poor poor because they're benefiting from them being kept in poverty. And it's important to know yourself as a practitioner. You need to know that you bring your set of understandings or biases and experiences that all shape and affect how you look at the issues. So as we move forward, we're going to look at a couple of different of the models that you read about. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on them, but we're going to just point out a couple of things that I think are helpful as we move forward. So the first one of those is Poverty as Entanglement, or the Poverty Trap, by Robert Chambers. And so you can refer back to your reading to find out more about the specific areas and issues. But one of the things that this model helps us do or helps us realize is that poverty is more than just a material lack of things, but it's all sorts of different areas of life and facets of life that blend and mix together to help contribute to that. And so in order to really get a better understanding, we need to take into account all these different areas. The second system is Poverty as Lack of Freedom to Grow by Yavi Yakarian. And he talked about that we don't necessarily know what flourishing human life is, but we know what restricts it. And so he talks about four areas that restrict it: the physical, the mental, the social, and the spiritual. And so then as we combat the issues, our job is to help remove these limitations so that life can begin to flourish. Now, a key contribution that he makes is that there is usually someone or a stakeholder beyond each limitation. That it's just not this abstract factor, but there's a person there causing each limitation to take place. So there's a couple of key contributions that this system makes. One is just that he locates the causes of poverty in people, not necessarily circumstances, and that each of the people have stakeholders, or each of the stakeholders beyond the different limitations have stakeholders themselves. And so it's important to look beyond the fact, to ask our questions such as, well, why is that happening? Well, why is that important to so-and-so? Well, why is that important to the person behind them? And try to trace the causes back as far as we can so we can begin to treat things at the root and not simply treat the symptoms. A third system that you've read about is Poverty as a Disempowering System by Yakimir Christian. Now, Christian's worked for an extensive amount of time in India working with things, and so he has these systems and that relate to it. So it's helpful here is looking at it as not just from a individual personal standpoint, but all these different systems that we live within, whether it's the cultural system, the social system, spiritual religious systems, the personal systems, and the biophysical systems all relate and interweave themselves, and they all lead to what he calls a web of lies that we can believe about ourselves. And another interesting concept that he mentions is the God complexes of the non-poor. And so we tend to like to play God in people's lives or make decisions for them that aren't necessarily ours to make in their lives. And we create systems and structures that justify the positions of the non-poor in the lives of the poor, whether it's a slumlord or whether it's a political system that excludes people as actors. Those have all tended to be created for the benefit of the few people in power as opposed to the people that find themselves in poverty. So this is often expressed by absolutizing themselves in the lives of the poor, or making a place where you need me in order to survive. Often talked about the eternal yesterday. Well, it's always been like this, and so therefore it's always going to be like that into the eternal tomorrow. And to safeguard our power by our interactions with other people, or to justify our interactions of being of positions of power with our peers or other people that have the same motives or the same agendas. So we often try to influence areas of life beyond our scope as well. So maybe it's a teacher trying to influence lives beyond that, or a landlord trying to influence the work life of his tenants, or so on and so forth. So oftentimes these God complexes, another huge contribution that Christian makes is the concept of the Mart Identity. So the captivity to the God complexes of the others and deception by principalities and inadequacies in worldview lead to an identity being marred, or I don't know who I am or who I was created to be, and I'm excluded as an actor in my own life and my own reality, and I begin to internalize and believe what other people are saying about me. And so the results of poverty then is that people who are poor no longer know who they are or their being, nor do they believe that they have a vocation or gift of any value they're doing. So this has been marred. And so oftentimes as we begin to work with folks who find themselves in the position of poverty, this first step of recovering identity is so crucial, but it's also one of the hardest steps to make. And then finally, we'll touch briefly on the relational understanding of poverty as presented by Bryant Myers. Now, there's a more extensive video on this, so we're just going to touch on this quickly. But one of the contributions this makes is it's relationships. Relationships that either work for or against people are what find themselves in poverty. So whether it's my relationship with myself, a poor self-worth, a poor self-esteem, my relationship with my community that it doesn't work, with the systems around me, whether it's the educational system, the political system, the economic system, and so on and so forth. If my relationships are not working for me, then I am going to be found in some sort of condition of poverty. So then, we serve a God that's all about reconciliation. And so, if we remove those relationships that don't work, then we can find this shalom that has been talked about, this better life abundantly that we're all after. So then, the causes of poverty, according to Myers, he would say at the deepest level, poverty is what happens to people whose relationships do not work for their well-being. And what causes relationships to not work for their well-being? He would say the cause is spiritual, or it's sin that is causing these relationships to break down and not work for people. Now, you could be looking at this and thinking, well, that's all nice and well and good, but doesn't that mean that in some essence we're all poor? Because we all have relationships that don't work for us. Well, exactly. The poverty of the non-poor is a very real thing as well. So we have to remember that we all are created in the image of God. We are all fallen, and we all need redemption. All of us in the human condition are really in the same boat. We're just experiencing different contexts and different situations within that. However, for those of us that might not be economically poor, it's often harder to hear the good news because we're more self-reliant than we should be, perhaps. But however, there is a Mart identity that happens there, and in fact, having too much is as bad as having too little. Proverbs 30:8 and 9 says, "Give me neither poverty nor riches, but give me only my daily bread. Otherwise I may have too much and disown you, and say, Who is the Lord? Or I may become poor and steal, and so dishonor the name of my God." So there's something to having too much or too little that is not good. And a lot of that depends on where we're putting our eyes and our worth and where we're finding our value from. So, as we wrap things up and come to a conclusion of our understanding of poverty, the poor are people whose identity has been marred, and this marring has been internalized, and they have a poverty of being. The poor are also people who have forgotten their true vocation, or a poverty of purpose. They've lost their purpose in life. And the poor are people whose relationships work against rather than for their well-being. And so there's a poverty of relationship there. And so our job as practitioners is to come alongside what God is already doing to see if we can be agents of reconciliation, agents of change, so those relationships can start to work for as opposed to against those who find themselves in poverty. Now, a closing thought to hopefully encourage us as we move from this point that there is hope comes from Origen, who was a 3rd century theologian, who said this: "The poor are said to be the ragtag and bobtail of humanity, but Jesus does not leave them that way. Out of material you would have thrown away as useless, he fashions people of strength, giving them back their self-respect, enabling them to stand on their feet and look God in the eye. They were cowed, cringing, broken things, but the Son has set them free." Amen.